buenos días a todos y todas. Yo soy Ernesto Herrera, soy director general de Reforestamos. También soy presidente del Comité Mesoamericano de la Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza. Y la verdad es que estamos muy contentos de tener en ese día la tercera sesión de Jueves de Escazú. Va a ser una sesión muy interesante. Vamos a estar hablando de temas de relaciones con el derechos de participación, para la participación, que es uno de los temas centrales en el acuerdo de Escazú. Nos faltan 2 sesiones más, el próximo jueves y el que le sigue. Y pues a nombre del Comité Sudamericano, a nombre del Comité Mesoamericano y también a nombre del Comité Caribeño, que somos los 3 comités que nos organizamos para estar fomentando este diálogo regional, tanto en español como en inglés. Aquí quiero agradecer a Ian por la traducción simultánea y también quiero agradecer mucho a Mara Bocaletti, porque va a ser la persona que nos comparta la sesión de encuadre para nuestro taller. Sin más, le quiero pasar la palabra a Raquel Jiménez, quien va a estar moderando esta sesión. Y también, pues muchas gracias, Janet, por toda la colaboración. La verdad es que tu ayuda ha sido fundamental. El compromiso de Guatemala para estos diálogos de Escazú es evidente y pues muchas gracias, Janet. Y adelante, Raquel, gracias.
Gracias, Ernesto. Pues bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todas nuevamente en este tercer jueves de Escazú.
Sorry, our microphone was off. Welcome everybody. We're going to give some brief indications just to begin our session. We will invite everybody to rename themselves on the username tab. In the bottom part of your menu, you can see the directions on how to click on the icon and select your name so you can rename yourselves. So we invite you to write your name, what institution you represent, as well as what country that you come from. The name of your institution or organization, so we know everybody. Another important thing, like in all these virtual sessions, we invite you to keep your microphones on mute while you are not participating in the meeting. And if you notice that your connection is unstable, you could disable the video to improve the connection. In some cases, you may need to restart the platform. For any comments, you can use the chat and you can leave your questions and comments there. So you can start putting your questions and comments there and we will get to them. I'd also like to let everybody know that this session will be recorded and will then be uploaded to our YouTube channel. That is the YouTube channel of CISP in the Commission of Economics and Environmental Politics. So you can always go back and re-listen to those sessions. Also for our English-speaking audience, you can go to the interpretation channel. You will find this icon at the bottom of your screen, the small globe where you can activate the English translation option. If you want to return to the original audio, you simply turn it off. Do not click on the Spanish link because that will take you to the Spanish translation booth, which is not active at the time. I would like to welcome you all and welcome our speaker today. Her name is Mara Bocaletti. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She very gracefully accepted our invitation so she can talk to us about the right to access to public participation. She is a lawyer and a notary public in Guatemala with a master's degree in policy and environmental affairs. She also has a political science master's degree from the University Rafael Andívar in Madrid. She is currently the director of the International Platform Against Impunity in Guatemala, and she is a part of the board of the Alliance for Environmental Rights and Water. During 5 years, She was a consultant to the Norwegian Embassy in Guatemala in charge of environmental, human rights, and gender projects. She is currently a consultant on themes having to do with green economy, following the recommendations of the Special Realtor on Environmental Defenders of the United Nations and the Inter-American System of Human Rights, and within the legal framework of social and environmental issues. She has a vast experience, has taken part in many workshops, forums, and seminars, and we are very glad to have her here with us today. Mara, welcome. You will have about 15 minutes for your presentation. So I will begin my projection now.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias Raquel y también Ernesto y a todos los organizadores de
Thank you, Ernesto,
realmente
and all the organizers of this event,
para poder conversar acerca
organizers.
de este
We will
acuerdo
talk
regional sobre el acceso a la
now
información,
about the
información pública,
regional agreement
acceso a la
to the
justicia en
access
asuntos
to public
ambientales en América
participation
Latina y el
and to justice
Este es el nombre
of
largo,
environmental
Escazu.
issues.
Efectivamente
So,
para la Alianza de Derecho
for
Ambiental y
the
Agua, de la cual yo
Alianza de Derecho Ambiental y Agua,
gusto de ser
from
parte
which
de esta junta directiva
I'm
de
part
la
of,
Alianza y para la
and
plataforma
I'm
internacional
part
de
of the
sostenibilidad que también pues
committee.
directora regional de la
I'm also
plataforma
the
y muchas
regional
organizaciones de
director
la región
of the
latinoamericana.
platform.
Este tema es fundamental.
This
Realmente
is a
un
key
tema para
matter
consideramos para brindar una serie de condiciones en materia de derechos humanos
to give
y también en derechos
a
ambientales
series of
como una gran oportunidad vemos el acuerdo
key
de Escazú. Entonces yo
needed
rápidamente y tomando en cuenta los 15 minutos que me han
assurance
sido
and
brindados,
agreements.
quisiera pues comentar sobre
I want to speak
esta importancia que ahora haremos
about the
énfasis
importance
en
started with 33
24
countries of
países
Latin
firmaron
America
en
and the
2018
Caribbean.
y firmaron
In
el
24
acuerdo en la
countries,
reunión del
it was
Consejo de
signed,
Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas y actualmente desde el 12 de abril
and
de este año,
nowadays,
el día
from
de
the
22 de abril
12th,
de este año, perdón,
April 12th
12 países han
of this
ratificado
year,
el acuerdo,
12
el cual es
countries have
resultado
ratified this
emanado
agreement.
de la Conferencia de Naciones Unidas para el
This
Desarrollo Sostenible, pero que
came
incluso
from
toma
the
otros
United Nations Convention,
acuerdos, declaraciones,
and
marcos
it was based
normativos
with
internacionales, como lo veremos más
in
adelante,
other
y que
agreements
además
and
tiene una relevancia
frameworks,
por ser el primer
and it's
tratado
relevant
regional
because it's
ambiental de
the
América
first
Latina y el Caribe.
agreement
Es decir, no existía
in the
una
region.
herramienta como esta
Before, we didn't
a
have
nivel
a tool like this
latinoamericano en la región.
at the
Es el
regional
primer
level.
tratado que
This
reconoce
is the
la
first
importancia de los
treaty
defensores, de la figura de
that
los
recognize
defensores
the importance
ambientales,
of the
que son
defenders,
la primera
the
línea
environmental
de
defenders
defensa de los bienes
who are
naturales y
on the
que
first in the first
actualmente pues
line.
lamentablemente Latinoamérica se lleva los primeros
Latin
lugares
America is
en
first
la
always
criminalización
in
de
the
los activistas
criminalization
y lamentablemente también en los asesinatos a los
and
defensores
in the
ambientales.
murders to
Pero aquí ha
the
habido una negociación
environmental
realmente
defenders.
innovadora a todo lo
Here
que
we
hasta
have
el momento se
had
conocía como
really innovative
formas de participación
negotiations,
desde el público, desde la sociedad civil.
and they
Entonces,
have
de
taken
esta
into
manera
consideration the
querríamos
public
esto
participation.
en esta mañana.
And that's what we're
Y
talking about
vamos
this
a
morning.
continuar conociendo un poquito más acerca
We
de
will
las
know a little bit more
antecedentes
about the
nacional. Cabe
background.
destacado que definitivamente al ser el secretariado del, del acuerdo,
ECLAC has says
conlleva
that
y garantiza algunos
they are guaranteeing
aspectos que son importantes y que
some
quisiera
aspects that
resaltar.
are important.
Para principiar, pues sí, efectivamente, el
First,
acuerdo está
the agreement
garantizando este principio 10
guarantees
sobre
the
cómo tratar las
principle
cuestiones
10
ambientales. Es
regarding how to deal with the
garantiza la
environmental issues.
participación de todos los ciudadanos
This
interesados
guarantees the
en beneficio
participation
de la
of
ronda y
each individual and citizens that are
una negociación con un
interested.
proceso abierto de parte
Has been an open negotiation.
inicial de 10 países que impulsaron
10
la
countries
cumbre Río más 20
were the ones that kicked
una
off
negociación,
in
un instrumento
the
que
Rio Declaration.
realmente recopilara los deseos y alcances de la población en general sobre los
This
también
gather
temas
all the worries
desafíos
and
a los derechos
challenges
de acceso.
and interest of all the
Entonces,
people
a través de un mecanismo
regarding
público regional
rights of
que
access.
permita a todos los interesados una
This
información
allows
periódica y una
to all
participación
the
abierta en
ones that
este
are
acuerdo,
interested to have an
crea
open participation.
este acuerdo con estas
That's why this
características.
agreement
El
was
eje
made with
principal es el
this
fortalecimiento
characteristic.
también de
The
las
main
capacidades como un elemento central para los estados y
importance
para los funcionarios
is that
públicos,
this
sobre todo.
works
Y bueno, también
as a key
evidenció la
tool
participación de los
for the
estados del
governments.
Caribe,
And we have to
que han
highlight the
sido
participation of
reconocidos
the countries of the
internacionalmente,
Caribbean.
valorado por distintas instancias internacionales, desde
This has
el
been
Comité
highly
Económico
recognized,
Municipal, pero también los foros de ministros del medio ambiente,
especially
la
in
Asamblea de
the
las
sessions
Naciones
of
Unidas sobre el
ECLAC,
medio ambiente, la CELAC,
but also in the
y vemos
UN
que también hay una referencia
sessions
muy
about environment.
importante hacia el convenio Aarhus sobre participación ciudadana
We
en
will
Europa,
see
pero que incluso
that this
el
also had
acuerdo de Escazú la supera en algunos aspectos. Y vamos
a
a
lot of
ver
similarities with the
más
European
adelante.
agreement.
Para hacer una remembranza de
To
lo que ha sido este
remember
proceso, pues tuvo toda
this
una
process,
etapa preparatoria desde
it
la
had
reunión de
a
Río más
first
20,
stage
con 14 reuniones del grupo de trabajo,
in this Rio Declaration with
donde se documentó toda la
14
participación
meetings
activa y
to
qué
work
implicaba esa
in
participación
this,
activa desde la sociedad civil.
to work on what
Las
the
etapas de
civil
negociaciones
participation
ya se
meant
llevaron a cabo durante
in the
4
phase of
años
negotiation
de
was
largas
done in
discusiones,
4
de
years
un proceso
with
de
long
incluir
debates
temas que no estaban
to include
considerados
topics that
en
weren't
un
included first
principio, sino que estaban
at the
más
beginning,
encaminados a las formas tradicionales de generar un acuerdo o una
since
declaración internacional.
they were more related
Y
to
sobre
the
todo
traditional
permitir la
ways.
vinculación y
These
coordinación de la participación del público en
debates
estas reuniones internacionales para
allowed
contribuciones directas en
to
los
take
temas
into
de transparencia,
consideration
de
the public
participación,
participation,
que fuera incluso
also
una
transparency
forma sencilla para poder incluirse
in these
en este proceso. Y el
debates. They
ACLAC
talked
como
about
una herramienta para poder
the process that they would make,
en sus
and
reuniones
ECLAC
de una
had
manera
a process of
fácil y activa, y
subscribing
todavía
to
permite
participate,
ese mecanismo, así que cualquiera que quiera
and
acceder a
that
él
mechanism
puede inscribirse en cualquier momento
still
y recibir
exists.
constantemente actualizaciones sobre la
So
implementación.
you can get access
Hasta
to
su
it if you want to be
finalización,
updated.
y por eso recibe la
In
aprobación por
2018, it
50
was
estados, donde se
adopted,
adopta
it was
y
approved
se apertura a
in Costa
ratificar
Rica,
en la 73ª Asamblea General de
in
Naciones
the
Unidas. ¿Por
Assembly,
qué
General
es
Assembly of the UN.
importante este acuerdo? Básicamente, queremos referirnos aquí
Why
a
do we say
los
that it is
contenidos del
important?
acuerdo en sí, a los
We want
principios
to talk about the
fundamentales
content of the agreement and why
también.
it's an important one.
No vamos
The
a
environmental
referirnos
principles that are established here. We're not going to go into great detail, but it's an invitation for you to read the text of the agreement and familiarize yourself with these principles, many of which were already included within the environmental themes. But I would like to point out the pro persona principle, for example, which is brought in directly from the human rights. It's a legal framework that is included in legislation having to do with human rights, and it must be interpreted that the law must be interpreted in the most positive way possible for the concerned parties, and that is the lens through which any process of access to information and participation must be viewed through. And of course, access to justice must be also undertaken in that way. Another innovative principle is non-regression and the progressivity in everything having to do with environmental rights. So this really gives us a unique opportunity. It has not been recognized by any regional legislation so far, but it is really motivating a lot of opinions and consultations within qualified entities and specialized entities, for example, in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, to include these principles and these agreements. They're very innovative principles. It is not allowed to go back on or regress on some of these norms. And these are cutting edge norms in environmental legislation. And so political or economic interests cannot promote a regression in these legislative frameworks. So this is a very important innovation. Of course, there is the principle of sovereign equality between states for those who have been promoted from an opposition to the agreement. There is here, they're talking about an interference between states and state sovereignty, but this is not the case because one of the inspiring principles is to consider state sovereignty, but also collaboration and equality between the states, the Latin American states as much as the Caribbean states. So I'd like to move on now to the next slide. And Escazu agreement is forces states or requires states to guarantee these rights to access to information in terms of capacity building, cooperation, and environmental issues. Of course, this right to access is interdependent and cannot be separated into its parts. But today we're going to make a special emphasis in citizen participation in decision-making processes. What does this mean? That any person as an individual or part of a collective in a situation where the environment is being impacted has the right to take part as a citizen to provide information and have a stake in the decision-making process. This is in the creation of norms and legislation and political and strategy plans and at the different levels. So to seek out the ways in which citizens can participate is a basic right in this agreement. And we can see how the region has really advanced in this theme in terms of environmental licensing and environmental impact laws, and also through citizen consultations so that the population can make their contributions to local governments and also, of course, at a higher level, at the decision-making level, even on the national plane. So the exercising of this right in this agreement definitely requires that the public have previous access to information that is relevant for their participation, and that also a reasonable time frame be accounted for. So this is definitely inspired in the American Convention to exert a democratic control when it comes to state processes, the right to question and monitor, also take part a real participation in the decision-making process. The law has to guarantee how and in what space citizens can participate. This must be published. The documents have to be made available in a way that is accessible, about all the information about environmental impacts, to guarantee the principles of transparency and public access to information. Of course, these are themes that can go from damages and risks that can take part in a territory, and above all, also considering that any person can challenge these acts or even challenge the omission or the non-publication of the information, the relevant information that must be made known in terms of health and environmental themes. So any impact, these planning processes have to be sought out for any project that has impact, and effective dialogue has to be established. They have to be participatory, they have to be trustworthy, and they can be promoted directly towards the people who are affected, or for anybody who feels they might be affected by an environmental issue. Moving on to the next slide, I would like to refer to the real progress that we have seen at the regional level. Please, let's go back. The right to public participation definitely is a reflection of different regional instruments that is established in international agreements and legal frameworks that are already established. For those of us who come from the environmental world, these are very familiar agreements, but it is also inspired on the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals therein. The states are compelled to guarantee information to the public and access to the decision-making process, and how these decisions are being made, how projects are being planned and implemented throughout the entire phases, through public hearings, through consultation, through allowing access to processes, and also making laws effective. So this is a binding agreement for the states, and the majority of states in the region have included some of these provisions specifically for public participation in terms of environmental legislation. And they've also created several different kinds of councils for citizen participation. There is some level of involvement in the environmental evaluation of impacts. However, we see that really when it has to do with real frameworks and political instruments, such as laws and rules, public involvement levels are woefully very restricted. However, we see that here in the region, we have a very interesting example about environmental impacts, which is in Chile. They have introduced within their forms to allow for public participation and citizen participation, where by law, there is a mechanism for public involvement directly on any kind of policy or plan that is going to be promoted. And it must be documented in the reports how public involvement took place in these aspects. So there's, for example, a public consultation for everything that is environmental impact studies and strategies. And this consultation leads us to, has a specific framework, that must be allots for at least 30 days for the public to access to the information and attend the meetings where they can present their arguments. Also, in the social impact studies and reports, there is also a time frame for organizations to have at least 60 days to make their statements on these projects. And it also says that it must be considered within this process. Qualified information must be taken into account. So this compels the states to provide the information that this consultation process took place and that all the parties and relevant experts were consulted. And it is actual legislation that could have consequences if this process is not undertaken. It can have fiscal or legal consequences. Also, Colombia has set an interesting precedent. For example, if 3 nonprofit organizations or civil society organizations or 100 citizens require a public hearing, this public hearing must be promoted by the state, and the decisions of each process must be informed through an official gazette, through the national system of the environment. So this really provides opportunities to truly motivate and undertake involvement from citizens with some power for decision making and for inputs. Costa Rica also at the Mesoamerican level has by law, they must take into account the criteria that has been provided by the social impact studies. In order to accept or not accept public inputs and recommendations. So this process must be accessible also to the public and must include the public's inputs. So we see that there are 2 kinds of involvement within the instruments that are being discussed. One is involvement from civil society, organized civil society, and this allows for the creation of specialized councils. And for this, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, or Mexico, even Panama have established these kinds of involvement mechanisms. And it definitely caught my attention to know the experience of Ecuador with their empty chair mechanisms in autonomous governments. These are public. They leave an empty chair so that one or several representatives, citizen representatives can sit at the table when these themes are being discussed, and they can participate actively in the debate and in the decision-making process with a voice and a vote. So we see that there are some interesting initiatives that are being confirmed and taken up within the Escazu agreement with this kind of involvement, also this direct involvement that can be promoted in other realms of involvement, for example, in Bolivia and Ecuador, where also we see that it's been enshrined into law. Public participation and citizen involvement has been enshrined in law, and mechanisms to promote this involvement have been established. So what is essential here with this theme is to put into a legal instrument mechanisms that can really promote public involvement and citizen involvement. I think there is the biggest challenge. So moving on now.
How from the access to the information it was promoted in the framework of the Escazu Agreement that initially hadn't recognized the most important events in benefit of the defenders, the obligation of creating a list of contaminated areas, and under what type of contaminating agent it's being affected, and also the location of the area in the region, so the people can speak out about it and see what situation they are working against. And speaking about the activities in the principle of not regression, one of the proposals that the public made was creating tools and organisms to broaden the access to justice. This is something that goes from the government to the citizens and also between governments to create a collaboration and to improve the governments where they haven't gone forward in their participation mechanisms. It also guarantees the participation regarding the participation, not only about the affected party, but everyone. There is also an expert's participation, so it gives it a more strong base. I want to highlight that the rights of access create a better democracy because they make the decisions to be more trusting, because it guarantees to people that they will be heard and also gives them a feedback about why their input wasn't taken into consideration. It also helps to create less conflicts, because in our region we have a lot of conflicts in environmental matters, which is very worrying, especially regarding the access to the natural resources. It is more clear, the decision-making process. It puts a hold to the corruption. It's really interesting how European countries are putting a hold to the countries like Brazil that have not really created politics to safeguard these resources. So European countries are putting a hold to the economic agreements because of this. There have been discussions about who can enter these processes. The World Bank has also made clear their intention that this agreement is a reality for the Latin American countries. We are also going forward in the access to rights of justice. This topic needs to be strengthened through an active participation of the citizens to create a better government and governance system. They should be promoted for the government, because this is the only way of creating a more solid base to have governments and to have a sustainable process. We can go to the next slide. Really, the figure of recognizing the defenders of the human rights and environmental rights is something that is pending to see how far it will go and how far we can count with this specific protection for those who are on the front line fighting for these rights. I think this is the conclusion of the presentation, so we can open the discussions. Where are we in this process? Especially regarding in the first COP that will take place after the implementation of this, and where we will see if we will put into practice the processes of implementation of this agreement. We hope to see participation of the indigenous people. They are asking for a spot for them so they can speak about their needs of all the indigenous people. We'll be putting attention to see how they are going to implement this agreement. I think there is a chance for the organizations of movements at all levels, how, like the Principle 10 says, so we can have a real participation in this space. Thank you so much. I don't know if we're going to open this space to have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Mara, for all this information that will give us context and some meat for our workshop now. So we invite everybody to start writing their questions on the chat. We're a little bit behind time, but I think we can give space to a couple questions. I see that Carla Priuti has her hand raised. Perhaps if you would like to ask your brief questions. I think your microphone is open if you'd like to speak. Yes, thank you. Good morning. Just very quickly, thank you for the presentation. I have 3 questions or points. When she said that no country had legislated, I think I would like to say that in Mexico, almost automatically, since the Constitution was reformed in 2011, where there's a provision that all environmental agreements and human rights agreements at the international level become laws. We'd have to look at this because the problem with Mexico, like many countries, but especially in the environmental legislation, is the lack of application of the law. So when you mentioned that there were councils, I would like to, in Mexico's experience, if you could share with me which NGOs or organized civil society are proposing these councils, and to know if these councils have some kind of link, because it seems very important to me that the state does not evaluate itself on these very important things. My third point is to know whether Mexico and all these countries that are going to ratify this agreement have provisions for free, prior, and informed consent as part of the participatory mechanisms. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't know if we do the round or we just start the answers. I think I can mention the other questions now because we have very little time. Ronel asks us, what criteria do you consider must be taken into account to recognize an environmental defender? Francisco Javier Camarena asks us, what experience is there in the balance of of interest and the proportionality principle between available to information and privacy. And also what countries are still about to ratify the agreement. Go ahead, Rana. Thank you, thank you. Very interesting questions. And well, the challenge of being able to answer all of them the way they should be. Just I'd like to say that the point I was making about there not being within the regulatory frameworks, the environmentally regulatory frameworks, there is not legislation in terms of the principle of non-regression and including the principle of non-regression. They basically based on human rights legislation, but not on environmental legislation. So this is where we see the fusion, the very interesting fusion that is happening with the Escazu agreement by regulating norms that are normally part of the human rights realm, but putting it within the normative frameworks of environmental legislation. And these will have to bring on reforms, adequate reforms. I know, and here, forgive me, I am living in Guatemala, so I can't rightly say all the organizations that are involved in direct actions and activity on these themes. For example, the creation of these committees, these specialized committees. However, there is involvement, and in the moment that the participation mechanism was created, 6 representatives were elected from different countries that had been promoters of the agreement from the onset, and Mexico was one of these countries. And even countries that have not yet ratified the agreement could remain in one of these public participatory mechanisms or councils. So this is how Tomás Severino, a Mexican from the organization Natura, I believe he has that representation at the country level in Mexico. He represents also the presidency or the chair is in Chile. I know you had she came on to the Escazu Thursday last week, I know. And also we have these 6 participants where 2 of them are the active representatives. One of them is Chile and the other one is from Jamaica. And also basically, well, there is a mechanism where we can implement and become involved and advocate for a full civil society involvement. So the criteria for this recognition of human rights defenders, well, they are already in the Declaration for the Protection and Promotion of Environmental Defenders and Human Rights Defenders. We just have to, anyway, these will be the mechanisms used, the framework used for discussion, and they are currently being elevated and being integrated into the first conference of the parties, which is the first COP, will be in 2022, where rules will be established for the criteria to recognize someone as an environmental or human rights defender. From the state level, there has been some criteria to say, well, there will be a recognition with some kind of ID card for environmental defenders. From the human rights perspective, this is inadmissible because there are already a set of criteria to be recognized as such. And above all, that recognition comes from the social movement, from the active involvement that is happening on the territories on the ground. So this is really the criteria that establishes who can be considered a defender. And in this case, an environmental or human rights defender. So it's going to be very important to take part in this process and see what criteria are finally integrated and taken into account. And like I say, these are being built as we speak. So in terms of as the links with citizen involvement and free, prior, and informed consent, well, this is something that comes from a regulatory framework for citizen involvement from the agreement at 169 that establishes that free, prior, and informed consent is the gold standard for taking any kind of consultation process, for undertaking it. So it must be voluntary, accessible in the languages of the region, and it has to take into account who's being impacted. So the real challenge is how to implement that. How do we achieve this linkage? So I think I'm missing one question. I'm sorry. Ashley, Mara, don't worry. We are inviting everybody to put their questions in the chat. So maybe there you can answer the questions via text. We have a very little amount of time.
Very short time to go to the workshop. Maybe you can go to one of the rooms so we can keep discussing these topics. Thank you so much, Mara, for this presentation and for your experience. I'm very happy and I'm looking forward to the debate that you will carry out in the groups. Unfortunately, I cannot stay to discuss in the groups with you because I have another appointment which I have to attend to. Thank you so much, Mara. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Mara. So we will go to the workshop. We'll have around 45 or 50 minutes. We will divide you in groups so you can work. We'll have an Spanish and an English room. We will be recording the discussions. That part of the session won't be shared on the YouTube video. We will use rooms. We will share the link of the groups, and once you are in there, you will have this first screen, and you have to click on guest access, and this will tell you to this screen where you have to put your name in your country so we can know where you are participating from. You have to agree to the terms and give access as guest. Once you are in the platform, you will see the board that is divided. The menu is really easy. You will see these little icons. You will have this one that has like a post-it shape, post note. And you will have this option, color options. To move around, you have to click on the hand around this concept board, and to see the size to make zoom. In the left corner, you have the zoom option. So you can click on the icons to zoom in and zoom out. You also have the menu to configure your writing. So we will have a quick presentation, and we have 3 questions. For each of them, we will have around 10 minutes. After that, we will have the finishing part, so the moderators can share with us the more relevant comments and shared information. Here we have the questions. You will have them in the platform. The first one is regarding how prepared is your country in terms of legislation and policies to implement the Escazu Agreement on matters of access to public information or environmental issues. The second question is regarding what challenges or obstacles do you identify in your country for the implementation of the Escazu Agreement on matters of access to public information on environmental issues. And the third one is about the experiences of initiatives or projects, maybe initiatives that are being carried out with the governments regarding the matters of access to public information. Now we will be divided into the different groups.
De vuelta. De acuerdo, pues muchísimas gracias a todos y a todas por participar. Espero que les haya ido muy bien. Sé que es poquito el tiempo, pero pues eso nos motiva a seguir platicando mucho más de estos retos que tenemos con Escazu. Entonces, sin más, me gustaría pasarle la palabra a nuestro moderador o moderadora de la sala 1. Para que
breakout group 1, so they can tell us a little bit about their main findings or their main challenges. Well, according to me, that's me. Go ahead. Well, we had a very full and wonderful group. We had people from Argentina, from Mexico. At one moment, Joanna was there with us from Panama. We were able to see that we shared challenges without a doubt. And in terms of how prepared we are to take on the implementation phase, with regards to participation in the Escazu Agreement, we agreed that we have a legislative framework. There definitely needs to be some amendments made, but the point, and here's where the challenges come in, because there are many shared challenges. For example, the information, the access to information and getting the information out there. Also, these types of legislation with regards to indigenous communities and the people who are at the forefront of the issues. Also challenges in terms of including some frameworks to broaden participation. Maybe frameworks like the Escazu Agreement must be included. Also, we have this part of the inclusivity and participation, inclusion. So some examples were given of cases that have already been implemented with regards to involvement. For example, we talked about Lady Page here in Mexico. Lady Page was mentioned. How it was precisely an example in terms of involvement of women. Also cases between Ecuador and Peru having to do with cross-border pollution and how this has been taken on. These are very relevant cases, especially if we take into account that they involve more than one country. And also, we also mentioned watchdog groups. So this was essentially what we discussed. I'm sure I missed some details that came up in conversation that were very important, but I don't know if anybody else on the team would like to add a comment.
Está muy bien, Xiomara.
Excelente.
That's very good, Xiomara. Thank you very much, Xiomara. We go with the second room. Janet, I believe you moderated this.
Yes, thank you. We also had a really good discussion about what is going on in the different countries. We had people from Panama, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. In general, in all countries, there is legislation and they have environmental politics and laws. We still have to work in mechanisms to apply the legislation, but also they have a lack of knowledge from the individuals that are interested in this, the groups that are working in this, because they don't know about all this legislation, how to be against projects. This is what is happening in many countries. There are some regulations that recognize the right of having a healthy environment, but we have a lack, like Ana said, in Argentina. The public audience is not there. Same with Guatemala. The intervention of the groups is not effective. I think in general, there is legislation, there are policies, but we still have that part where the authority has to work. And we need training so they can have a real public participation. I think I'm also hearing similar things to the room that I was in.
Room 4.
¿Me escuchan?
Do you hear me?
Sí, Wendy, adelante.
Yes, go ahead, Wendy. Okay, in our group, we had mostly Mexicans and only one person from Panama and myself, who am in Dominican Republic. And question number 1 was that the common theme we have in all our regions is that there has been a lot of progress in terms of legislation for participation. However, there's very little budget. We're being told that budgets have been greatly reduced for implementation of these types of involvement mechanisms and participatory mechanisms and the inclusion of all environmental projects. Also, we were being told that there are many challenges for this, and this would be question number 2. Well, as I mentioned, the lack of budget, the lack of connectivity in some rural areas, which means that information does not reach communities in many regions. Also, involvement and citizen participation is very limited for some vulnerable sectors, especially having to do with the pandemic that has just simply exacerbated the risks and added new challenges. So one of the real challenges is in terms of participation is to is to generate information and strategies for people to participate. Also, in terms of the question on Panamanian initiatives, an initiative was shared about some communities that have become empowered and have managed to launch some initiatives from the private and public sectors. So I don't know if some of my colleagues would like to add to that about what we shared in our group.
Wendy?
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. Wait. Now that I have the microphone, I'd like to take advantage that we discussed that there's not a lot of access to media in terms of radio or internet to have a direct participation in the dialogue in each of the regions. So thank you much.
I'm going to speak in the last group. We spoke with people from countries from the Caribbean. One of them spoke about the experience that they are having in Santa Lucia. They are already working in making an evaluation, a diagnosis about the policies. Maybe they have some legislation and some policies, but they also are doing a further review. They are working for them to be considered in the constitutions. Another thing they talked about, and is something that we talked about in the last session, is the access to information, which is really linked to the access to public participation, because they need to be informed and know about this. So what we were talking with Charlene is how we can gather all this information in one place and to make it accessible to the public. Another challenge, the first one, is the creating conscious regarding the government, the ONGs, and the people that work here, the conscious about them. And finally, there are a variety of experiences. One of the initiatives will be creating an evaluation framework. So then we can start working on the implementation in a more appropriate way. I hope I'd highlighted all the important things that we discussed about. Now we can only thank you for your participation and invite you for our next section. Is the August 5th. We will be the right to access to justice in environmental matters and the protection of the defenders, environmental defenders. We will send you a mail with all the information and also a survey so you can evaluate the decision. Thank you for the moderators, the interpreters, Camila and Ian, and the participants. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Have a very good day, all of you. Thank you so much. A big hug to everyone.
Felicidades.
Congratulations. Very good session.